how much are we thinking about how to talk about our pain so that person will believe us and so that we won't sound neurotic, so that we won't sound hysterical? It's something that I think a lot about when I'm at the doctor. I think, what level should I say my pain is? Or how do I let this person know that, I'm a reasonable person? I think actually that's a kind of common way to engage with doctors, is trying to get the doctor on your side, because you need the doctor to help you.
Welcome to Migraine Again, helping you eat, breathe, survive, thrive, and engage better despite migraine. If you or someone you know struggles with migraine often, join us for today's insightful conversation. Now here's your host, founder and managing editor of MigraineAgain.com and co-host of the Migraine World Summit, Paula Dumas.
Do people with migraine fit into a specific personality type, like type A, creative, or analytical? Well, labels like these have been applied to us for decades, often without very strong evidence to support them. So if you've ever felt misunderstood, don't miss our talk with today's guest. She's the top expert on migraine, gender, and stereotypes like these. She thinks these perceptions are unfair and have far-reaching implications for you and the health care you get. And we'll be back to meet her right after this.
Support for Migraine Again and today's podcast is brought to you by SpeakYourMigraine.com. Developed by Amgen and Novartis, SpeakYourMigraine.com gives people with migraine a voice, combining facts and shared experiences to break stigmas and paint a clearer picture of migraine. You're listening to Migraine Again. For show notes and resources from this episode, check out our program page on migraineagain.com. And now, once again, here's your host, Paula Dumas.
So is there such a thing as a migraine personality? We're going to discuss that fallacy today with Joanna Kempner. Joanna Kempner is an associate professor in the Department of Sociology at Rutgers University, which really means she's a medical sociologist. She writes, researches, and speaks about medicine, science, politics, gender, and the body. And Joanna is also the author of Not Tonight, Migraine and the Politics of Gender and Health, which is an award-winning book that examines the gendered social values embedded in the way we talk about, understand, and make policies for people in pain. Plus, she's a migraine warrior herself. Joanna, welcome to Migraine Again.
Thank you for having me on your program.
Oh, we're delighted to have you here. And today we're talking about the migraine personality fallacy. What is the origin of this concept anyway?
The idea that people with migraine have a particular kind of character is old, and I've traced it back to the 18th century. But the phrase migraine personality and the way that we think about migraine as this particular kind of hysterical person really becomes a concrete idea in the early to mid-20th century, when psychosomatic medicine turns off. And it comes from a doctor named Harold B. Wolff. He was a neurologist who is commonly considered the father of modern headache medicine. And he's still much admired because he was the first person to really get headache medicine off the ground as a substantial medical subspecialty. And he also created these very clever experiments that demonstrated the physiological changes that people with migraine experience. And so he was able to show that people with migraine actually had physiological changes in their blood vessels, in their cranial blood vessels. But he thought that people with migraine, that these physiological changes originated in their psyche. So he was really interested in psychosomatic medicine, which at the time was super hip. And it was this idea that mind and body were connected. And so he was completely convinced that migraine was a real biological phenomenon, but he thought it was caused by an individual's personality.
So at the time, you're talking about the 1960s?
This is a little bit before that. He died in early 1960, so he's working in 1930s, 1940s.
Okay. So we don't love the idea of the psychosomatic headache, but Dr. Wolff did a lot of other great research, correct?
Yes, so he is held in high esteem for this work in measuring cranial vasculature and also for applying a scientific method and creating scientific experiments to study migraine. And so the American Headache Society every year gives out an award for the best journal article in Headache, and it's named after him.
The Harold B. Wolff Award, right?
That's right. And so it's a top honor in headache medicine, and that gives you any indication of how much he's admired in headache medicine.
Mm-hmm. So let's go back to the migraine personality. What are the aspects of the migraine personality that Dr. Wolff describes?
Well, it's very, very similar to what we now know as the type A personality. So the type A personality is also emerges in the same time period, and it's described in quite positive terms, really. So I often describe the migraine personality as something like the 1950s organization man. You can kind of imagine him as that white guy wearing a business suit, leaving his wife every day with a suitcase, and he goes to work and he applies himself and he works hard and he likes having a stable environment. But Harold Wolff argues that this is a very big responsibility, being the breadwinner and working so hard, and that it's not always this person is not always given the credit that they're due, and that leads to resentment, which leads to frustration, which leads to more resentment, anxiety, and then fatigue. And I think we all know that feeling that Dr. Wolff is describing, and then boom, a migraine starts. So that's what he thinks is really causing the migraine.
It's as if it diminishes the biology that is actually behind a migraine attack today, right?
It's interesting to think that, because that's how we now think about the relationship between mind and body. Because we now live in a moment in which biology is so highly valued that we almost diminish the mind as an important part of physiology. But in psychosomatic medicine, mind and body were equally valued. So he says at one point, and I went to his archives and I could see in his handwritten notes that he was telling his students that he thought the mind should be as valuable and thought of as tangible as blood vessels or as muscles. He thought it was just as real and just as important. And I think another thing that gets a little bit confusing now when you look back in the past is the era just prior to this, there was no real distinction between mind and body. So it's really only now that we think about body as being so much more important than mind. So I don't want to feel like anachronistic about how he was thinking. I don't think he was trying to diminish the body so much as trying to think about the body and mind as holistic and integrated.
Well, the mind-body connection today is very much respected, and we're coming up with all new treatments and theories that are related to the mind-body connection, like mindfulness and meditation. Biofeedback is another great example where we've got great evidence for migraine. So it was the kernel of a great idea that has significant potential for people with migraine.
Absolutely. But I think that that any idea can make a person feel really small if embedded in that idea are stereotypes and stigmas about what that person is capable of or what that person can do. And I think we can see that both in psychosomatic medicine, in the way Harold Wolff and his contemporaries talked about migraine, and also in the contemporary way in which migraine is talked about at the neurobiological level. So I don't necessarily privilege one way over the other of speaking, but I think we can look at the kinds of ways in which psychosomatic medicine went all wrong.
And it did go all wrong because we're not all type A's, and there are people with all different kinds of personality characteristics that struggle with migraine around the world. And so to lump everybody into one personality type is an injustice unto itself.
Absolutely. And this came from the way in which he developed his ideas about migraine. So Dr. Wolff had migraine himself, and this is very often true of people who study migraine, myself included. And he had a practice at Cornell Medical School in the Upper East Side of New York. And this is a very wealthy area of Manhattan. It was then as well. And his patients were mostly well-to-do. And occasionally he also experimented on his medical students or even himself. In any of these cases, he was seeing people who had money and resources, and they were presumably all white people. I never have read him mention race. Typically, that means that they were all white people, given the time. And so it's not really surprising that one of his favorite recommendations for his migraine patients was that they take a squash break every work day. That's what he would do. And when I was in his archives, I didn't see any indication that he thought this might not be a solution for some people. So, I mean, if he's seeing a lot of, particularly men taking a break from their workday, and he's describing them all as type A people who like to work really hard, and they're describing the resentment at being breadwinners for their families. So he had a generalizability problem. That's what happened. And the other issue is, turns to when he starts to try and talk about other populations.
Well, what's encouraging to me about his stereotype there is that it's a male stereotype.
Yes. And I always have to add in the race. It's a white male stereotype. And he talks about it in very positive terms.
Because there aren't as many women who play squash or, at that time, people of color.
Exactly.
Right. Fascinating. Well, we're going to talk more about this after the break and talk more about why is there so much ignorance about migraine.
Just a quick thanks to Amgen and Novartis, the makers of SpeakYourMigraine.com. Go to SpeakYourMigraine.com on your computer, tablet, or smartphone to take the Migraine Impact Assessment Test so you can understand how much of an impact migraine has on your life. This is Migraine Again, encouraging and empowering you in your battle against migraine because you deserve to feel better. You can hear this conversation again or share it with someone who might like to hear it by going to migraineagain.com. And now, once again, here's Paula.
And we're back with Joanna Kempner talking about the migraine personality fallacy. So, Joanna, you're working on some research on cultural ignorance, and here's today's word of the day, agnotology. Why is there so much cultural and medical ignorance about migraine?
The cultural ignorance, I think, has to do with the fact that everybody thinks they know about migraine because it's such a common disorder, and headache is even more common. So something like 99% of the population has had a headache at one point or another. And in common parlance, migraine and headache end up being synonymous, even though they're not. Migraine is a whole body neurological disorder. And so I think people just really misunderstand what a migraine is. Migraine is also a spectrum disorder, which most people don't know. So you can know a lot of people who have a migraine once a month or less than that, or even to my ears, once a week sounds like an amazingly few migraines.
Exactly.
But it's very hard for people to imagine what it's like to have a migraine every day. And so it comes as a surprise to many people that someone could be so debilitated by their migraine attacks that they would be on disability. And there just isn't a lot of visibility around the kind of that kind of severity for migraine. Now, the kind of ignorance that we have more broadly is around, I think, is caused by funding issues. So we have very, very few headache specialists in this country, and there's very little education in the medical schools around migraine. And some of that has to do with stigma, the stigma that people who have migraine feel around migraine is kind of, I don't know, contagious might be the wrong word, but there's a kind of contact stigma. So medical specialties kind of absorb a little bit of the stigma of the conditions that they treat. And migraine is, although it's the number one reason why anybody would go see a neurologist, neurologists hate to treat migraine. And it's a very low prestige disorder to treat. And so it's very, very hard to find doctors who have any kind of specialized education in migraine.
So let's pause there for a second. Why do you think neurologists hate to treat migraine?
Well, what I have always heard is from the neurologists who I've met, and also from headache specialists who've had to deal with their colleagues, is that neurologists complain that people with migraine are whiny and neurotic and just complain about their pain all the time. And they never go away. They just build up in your office because they don't know how to treat them and they never get better. So all the kinds of stereotypes one fears their doctor is holding against them are exactly the kind of stereotypes that I hear doctors hold about people with migraine.
Mm-hmm. There's also the respect issue when they go to a party with other doctors and they're standing around talking, and one person, sewed up somebody with a gunshot wound and somebody else performed heart surgery, and they're treating people with migraine, and those doctors don't understand migraine very well. They don't get the respect that they deserve for treating somebody with a chronic disabling disease.
Exactly. So there have been, not a huge number, but there have been a few studies that look at status hierarchies among physicians. And neurology is quite low because it's an internal medicine specialty. And then it's also, in neurology, headache medicine is the lowest status-wise. Okay. Now, just put a pin in that for a second. And I want to think just for a minute about the kinds of funding available for headache medicine, because there are just not the federal dollars allocated to headache medicine that there ought to be. And that has just a huge effect on how much interest is going to be generated in medical schools.
That's true. And we actually talk with Dr. William Young at length about that issue and why that occurs. So I want to focus today on the migraine personality fallacy with you because you understand that in an intimate way. I can't use the word ignorant without flashing back to Saturday Night Live and seeing Dan Aykroyd say to Jane Curtin, "Jane, you ignorant slut."
Okay.
And there are some times that we deal with other people in the community and we want to say, "Don't you get it?" But of course they don't get it because it's an invisible illness that they haven't experienced.
Right.
And there are these stereotypes that are out there about the kind of personalities. You must be high strung. You can't handle stress. You get hysterical at times. And we're talking about the origin of those things being back from Harold Wolff's day, right? So what roles do gender and women's sexuality play in this development of the migraine personality?
Well, when Dr. Wolff developed the migraine personality, he didn't really write about women at all. He has this huge book that he wrote all about migraine, and he hardly ever talks about women's patients. But then when he does, he mostly talks about women in terms of sex. So he describes 80% of the women that he, in his research, as sexually dissatisfied. He talks about how they seldomly attain orgasm and that at most they accept having sex, but only as a marital duty. And how they talk about sex as unpleasant or that they resent it.
Is there any evidence for that, or is he just assuming that?
Well, I don't know where he is getting his evidence of it, but there's no evidence more broadly in the population that women with migraine don't like to have sex. He also says that women with migraine are, quote, reluctant to accept the consequences of maternity. Now, I don't know where he's getting that from. I'm a mother, and I can tell you that I don't love parenting with a migraine. I don't know if that's what he means, but that's different than saying I don't accept the consequences of maternity. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know how he's interpreting what his women patients are saying. He does also say that his male patients were sexually well-adjusted, but he adds that their sex drive occasionally suffered as an accompaniment of ambition and hard application to work. And when they do have problems with sex, it's because they were married to sexually indifferent or frigid wives.
Well, this was in the Freud days, right? So could that have influenced his thinking?
Well, it's post-Freud, but yes. I mean, Freud was a huge influence. So, yeah, and I think that actually what's a constant, if you look through the history of medicine, and particularly through the history of migraine, right on up to today, you'll see that the approach that is taken towards women is pretty much always negative. So women are pretty much always to blame. So it may not be as easy to see in the way that we talk about women in medicine today, but it's there. It's a little easier to see in 1940s and 1950s medicine because we don't live in that time, and so it's a little bit more striking.
Well, Dr. Wolf is a man with migraine, so how was he able to reconcile his own experiences with this idea of the hypochondriac whiner that he put forth?
Well, he just didn't think men were hypochondriac whiners. He had a longtime lab assistant, and she described people with migraine as almost always sought-after exemplary citizens, responsible, conscientious, and reliable. She was talking about men with migraine, and I think that he was very comfortable thinking of himself that way. It was only when he was talking about women, and he wasn't really talking about women as whiners. That comes a little bit later, and that comes with his contemporaries like Dr. Walter Alvarez, who starts to talk about women as being neurotic.
And what did Alvarez have to say?
Dr. Alvarez was an admirer of Dr. Wolf, and he was also a founder in headache medicine. And when he talked about women, he talked a lot about women with migraine. And when he did, he really didn't hold back. For example, at one point he wrote, whenever a woman is having 3 attacks of migraine a week, it means that she is either psychopathic or else she is overworking or worrying or fretting or otherwise using her brain wrongly.
Sure. I use my brain wrongly all the time, but I didn't think anybody was noticing.
Exactly. And he very often talked about how when he had a woman who had migraine in his clinic, sometimes he thought maybe it was caused by she was worrying about her husband too often. And he would say things like, you're just so lucky to have a man who puts up with all of your illnesses. So I think when Dr. Alvarez starts taking this idea of the migraine personality and applying it to the women who he was seeing in the clinic, you really start to see how the migraine personality shifts when applied to women in the 1950s.
You know, so many people complain that they get this attitude from the doctor. They're trying to get respect. They're trying to get the treatment that they need, and the doctor doesn't understand them. But when they're talking about those doctors, they're generally not seeing a headache specialist. They're seeing a generalist who, again, hasn't gotten the training in headache medicine to understand the biology. And so they can be influenced by these historic notions about this migraine personality. And that can limit the care that we get. Is that right?
Well, I think that's only partly right. So I think it's very important to go see a headache specialist. I think headache specialist is your best chance of getting good treatment. I don't think that makes headache specialists immune to subtle forms of sexism in the way that they understand migraine. So, for example, I think that headache specialists have to be careful when they talk about people with migraine as having a migraine brain that is somehow different than other brains, that has to be treated as a sensitive brain, or talk about people with migraine as having a kind of sensitive constitution that's a diva or that is somehow overreacts to situations. Because I think this is much the same language as the migraine personality, but superimposed on the brain or reduced to the brain. And I worry about that. I think headache specialists can't just be left off the hook because they know more about migraine.
And oftentimes they have migraine themselves, which gives them a lens on it, which, you know, many of us have a bias on a condition because we experience it through our own eyes.
Sure.
And we think everyone's migraine is like ours, which is not the case.
I think you can also give doctors a lot of compassion when they have migraine. But I think that, you know, I like and respect headache specialists. I think that it's very good to seek out their expertise, but I don't think it lets them off the hook when it comes to engaging in these stereotypes. And it's important for them. I think headache doctors and headache medicine is becoming more mindful of this. I think they've been mindful of this for a while, and they're becoming more aware of this all the time, and they're particularly becoming very keen on ending the stigma of migraine. And as they do, I trust that they'll become more careful with the kinds of language and the kinds of stereotypes they may have inadvertently engaged in when researching and talking about what migraine is and what it isn't.
Right. Well, awareness is the first step. I'm Paula Dumas, and our guest is Joanna Kempner, author of Not Tonight, Migraine and the Politics of Gender and Health. And we'll be back in just a minute to talk with her about what you can do if you feel like you've been stigmatized.
A quick thanks to our advertisers, Amgen and Novartis, who have developed the SpeakYourMigraine.com website, where you can read stories, gather tools, and resources to help change the migraine conversation. It's time to turn private pain into collective change at SpeakYourMigraine.com. Hey, we'd like to hear about your life with migraine and offer some help and encouragement if we can. If you've got a question about migraine, we'll do our best to answer it and might even include it on one of our upcoming programs. If you'd like to submit a question, just go to our website, migraineagain.com/question.
I'm Paula Dumas, and we're back with Joanna Kempner. So, Joanna, do you believe that many physicians are still influenced by this line of thinking?
Sure, absolutely. Like I said, I think that it subtly colors how doctors continue to talk about the migraine brain. I don't think that it is going to show up so much in this same manifestation, right? I don't think doctors are going around, still believing in Harold Wolff or something like Dr. Alvarez. But certainly I think doctors still think that people with migraine are hysterical and neurotic and complain too much.
One day I was at the doctor's office, and he had my chart. He came and he consulted with me, and then he stepped out and he left the chart in the room, and he left the chart open. I could not help myself, and I went over and I just glanced at it. And this was not a headache doctor. This was a different type of doctor. But he called me a perfectly pleasant patient, which I was pleased with, that I was not the whining patient who was complaining all the time. But then I thought, well, what's the flip side of that? Is the next person going to be an absolute whiner, and that's going to be in his or her medical record? It's a little bit scary. But physicians, we have to remember, are human, and the perceptions that they get from us have largely to do with how we describe our pain and describe our disease and our condition and the symptoms. So what do you think that we can do to combat the damaging idea of the migraine personality when we encounter it?
I think that's a great question. I just want to say something about your story because it's so striking, which is, how much work do we as patients do when we go to see a doctor? Judy Siegel, who also has migraine and is a professor of rhetoric, wrote about the ghosts of patients past when we go to see a doctor, that we're always thinking about how's the doctor going to perceive us. And I think this is so incredibly true with migraine, and how much performing do we do? How much are we performing that perfect patient? How much are we thinking about how to talk about our pain so that person will believe us, and so that we won't sound neurotic, so that we won't sound hysterical? And so, it's something that I think a lot about when I'm at the doctor. I think, my pain, what level should I say my pain is? Or how do I let this person know that, I'm a reasonable person? And I think maybe I'm just nuts, but I think actually that's a kind of common way to engage with doctors, is trying to get the doctor on your side, because you need the doctor to help you.
Yeah, so are we selling it? Are we selling it by catastrophizing, making things sound dramatically worse than they are, like migraine is ruining my life? Or are we glossing over it to say, I've got this all under control, and gee, if you could just give me what I need, I'll leave your office and it will be fine.
Exactly. So I think that one of my answers to this question about how we're combating this damaging idea of the migraine personality is that we're kind of always doing it, right? Many of us always have this idea of the damaging migraine personality in our mind when we go to the doctor because we don't want to fall into those categories. So we're always engaging in it in some subtle way.
If they imply, how's your stress level? Migraine often affects people with type A personalities. Have you ever heard that from a doctor, short of slapping them? What should you do?
Sure. I mean, I've had doctors tell me that I just need to breathe more, or, maybe this is back, years ago, that maybe I just needed, I was anxious about not having a boyfriend, even though I didn't say that. I think we all have these collections of stories, and it's hard to know what to do. I mean, I think it depends on how confrontational you feel. I would say go find another doctor.
Or if you're in a mood, he's going to get it or she's going to get it. But, we talk about trying to have a healthy doctor-patient relationship where, just like any relationship, you can relate and be honest and frank, not perform, not dramatize, but just give it to them directly. And if you're not getting that back, then finding a doctor that does respect what you're dealing with, the person as well as the disease is really important. Yeah,
so I think that the best thing that we can, that I can say as a migraine advocate is don't internalize this idea that migraine isn't important or that you're somehow responsible for your migraine. That's the worst thing.
It's not your fault.
About their migraine. But if you know that migraine requires proper medical care and you're not getting it from your physician, I mean, handle that how you want to handle it, but find another doctor.
Right. As doctors will say, lost to follow-up. But if you think it's an education opportunity, you can also tell the doctor, look, what I'm hearing from you is XYZ, that you don't think that migraine is a real disease. And I kind of take exception with that. So I think I may need to see a different doctor with a different understanding. And then maybe that will produce change in that doctor, because every doctor is seeing hundreds, if not thousands, of patients.
Sure. I applaud the patient who does that.
Yeah, me too. I'm sure I chickened out many, many times and just moved on. Fascinating. Anything else you'd like to add, Joanna?
No, I think you've done a great job.
Great. Well, thank you, Joanna, for sharing your research and your discoveries about migraine with each of us.
Well, thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. And if you're itching for more of Joanna's incredible insights about culture and migraine, don't miss my interview with her on the Migraine World Summit, the 2017 Migraine World Summit. And today's interview with Joanna Kempner, along with our whole season of shows, is available at migraineagain.com.
And Paula, it's that time of the program where listeners ask questions and we try to answer. And incidentally, before I ask this question, we have heard from some listeners, primarily male listeners, who say they think that this program is mainly geared toward women. Well, it isn't, at least not intentionally, and coincidentally, today's question comes from a man. This is from Trent in Ohio, and he wants to know why it is he usually feels worse whenever the seasons change. And Paula, that's a question we hear quite a lot, isn't it?
We do. And Trent, it is not your imagination. People with migraine oftentimes feel like they are human barometers, and we know when the weather's going to change before it happens. So the Weather Channel should really employ us. But when the seasons change, a couple of things happen. You got temperature changes, oftentimes stormy weather. You got high winds. In certain seasons, high humidity, certain seasons, sun glare, and in almost every case, barometric pressure changes. And all of those things, the International Headache Society has identified as migraine triggers. In fact, the worst of them is probably barometric pressure changes. And 2/3 of people in a research study who have migraine were affected by barometric pressure changes alone.
So that's a majority of our listeners right there.
That's right. That's right. And personally, I didn't realize it was the weather that was causing me problems for so many years until someone mentioned it to me. And then I started noticing and tracking the pattern. I was like, they were right. It is. And this week has been a rough week for me, so I get it. Let me go back to the question, though. Why does this happen? So imbalances in our brain chemicals like serotonin, they believe are affected by changes in the weather. They being meteorologists and headache specialists. You cannot, though, change the weather, and that's what frustrates people so much. It's one of those uncontrollable triggers like hormones that make us feel like we are at the mercy of migraine. But if you know that storms are a trigger for you, you can look at the forecast. In fact, there's a great app called the AccuWeather Migraine Forecast that can tell you it's a good migraine day or a bad migraine day. And that gives you the power to prepare. So being prepared means avoiding things like other potential triggers that you can control, clearing your schedule if possible, paying extra attention to other contributing factors like your stress level, hydration, or diet. If you're looking for more on this, you can check out the Migraine Again article on how to dodge your next brainstorm. 8 tips on how to manage that. And there's a great Migraine World Summit interview with meteorologist David Steinberg, who's with AccuWeather and created the migraine forecast. So if you're a weather watcher and a migraine warrior, check out both of those 2 things, and that should help you. Great question, Trent.
And once again, the name of that app was the AccuWeather Migraine Forecast, right?
That's right.
Available where apps are found, I guess, the Google Play Store and iTunes.
Yeah, and on AccuWeather.com.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Paula.
Thank you, Rich. And thank you for taking time to listen. That's all the time we have for today's program. I'm Paula Dumas, wishing you a pain-free day.
And you've been listening to Migraine Again. We hope you feel encouraged and empowered in your battle against migraine because you deserve better. Remember, if you want to suffer less and live more despite migraine, be sure to check out all of the great resources on migraineagain.com. Follow us on your favorite social network, subscribe to our free newsletter, and this program. By the way, if you enjoyed today's episode, tell a friend about it. Then plan to be with us again next time on Migraine Again. You'll be glad you did.